Hello, everyone. This is Gilgamesh, and welcome to the first lesson here on the book of Isaiah. This lesson will be primarily a background on the book and some things to know about it. In order to understand Isaiah, you really have to understand a bit of what's happening in the 8th century BCE. You need to understand some of the politics that are going on through the region, and also just a background of how we got the book of Isaiah and what kind of things we're going to be looking at inside it. So if you see here in front of you, this is a map of the Middle East. And this is a modern map. This is just off of Google Maps. I found it to be one of the more useful ways to look at it. And if we look at this here, there's an area known as the Fertile Crescent, which starts down here by the Persian Gulf. And this is where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers are. This area here between the two rivers is known as Mesopotamia. And so the Tigris is the more northern river, and the Euphrates is the more southern river. And this was an incredibly important power center and will factor prominently throughout the book of Isaiah. So you need to understand what we mean when we say Mesopotamia, and when we talk about the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, it is roughly where modern Iraq is today. And so this area through here, down through the Mediterranean coast here and between the rivers, was known as the Fertile Crescent. It is where civilization began. Our oldest cities, including Jericho, which is perhaps the oldest city in the world, are all in this area, as well as Ur and Elam and many of the other very, very old cities when humans first started to build cities and live in cities. It's all along this area of the Fertile Crescent. And so this is the area here of Mesopotamia, and this area here is known as the Levant. And so if we were to look at this here, one of the great kingdoms that you're going to hear about is Assyria. Assyria in the book of Isaiah looms large. It is the greatest power on earth. It has an army no one can challenge, and it will run across the entire known world, destroying everything. And it will reign from the rivers up here clear out to the ends of the earth. It will have armies at its disposal which will be fierce and will cause dread and fear in anyone who believes they're approaching their territory. And so this is one of our great cultures that you need to understand is Assyria. This little marker up here to the north is the city of Nineveh. The other major city of Assyria is the city of Ashur, which is where Assyria gets its name. And this northern area of Mesopotamia here is where Assyria is ruling. However, it will control all of Mesopotamia and come down through the Levant and control all of it, and eventually will go all the way into Egypt. So Assyria is an area that will rule the world in the time of Isaiah and is going to play a huge role in Isaiah's prophecies and in the concerns of his people. The other power to know about in this area is Babylon, and this lower marker here is where the city of Babylon is located. We're going to see Babylon rise up like a Sith Lord and take out Assyria. Basically, Assyria's entire empire will collapse, and Babylon will come forward and fill the power void, and they're going to destroy Assyria, and they will eventually take over and destroy the kingdom of Judah. This will be quite a bit after Isaiah's lifetime, but one of the most interesting things about the book of Isaiah is it talks about this in quite some detail. And we'll get more into what that might mean in a moment. But these are the great powers of Mesopotamia's first Assyria, and during the reign of Assyria, Babylon was a fairly insignificant player. They existed, but they were a much more minor player, and they were probably a vassal to Assyria at the time. But then once Assyria weakens and kind of falls apart, Babylon will rise up and take over them. And you'll notice over here, a bit further to the east, I've mentioned Persia over here. What's going to happen eventually is Persia under Cyrus the Great will come over and take over Babylon about 70 years after Babylon destroys Jerusalem. And this also plays into the book of Isaiah in a few places. But the ones that loom large would be by far Assyria with the largest role and Babylon with a secondary role, and some mention of Persia in a few areas. And so these are the great powers over here to the east. And if we were to look over to the west here and the south, we have Egypt. Egypt, of course, everybody knows about Egypt because of the pyramids and the great papyri and everything that come out of Egypt. You'll notice that it is a kite-shaped country. regardless of what you might see on a political map with this big square here of the borders of Egypt and modern Egypt, the reality is there's only a small portion of it that's habitable. Most of Egypt is the Sahara Desert. And so we have this point here, right where modern Cairo is, where the Nile fans out into this triangular shape called a delta. We have a similar thing on like our Mississippi River. A lot of rivers do this as they approach the ocean. So the Nile fans out into a delta here and feeds into the Mediterranean. And so you have this larger triangular area up here, and then you have this thread of green, which follows the Nile all the way down. We're also going to talk about here in southern Egypt, there is a place called Kush, also known as Nubia. And actually in the 25th dynasty, they were the ones in charge of Egypt. At this point, we had the pharaohs of Egypt were actually a dark-skinned black people that came from Nubia and dominated Egypt. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in some areas of Isaiah where that becomes a significant thing. But yes, at this time, the great glory of Egypt had passed, and they were being dominated by these very southern people here. Also keep in mind that the Nile flows to the north, which is unlike most rivers that we're familiar with. And so Upper Egypt is actually here in the south, and Lower Egypt is in the north. Sometimes those terms can confuse people, but that's what we mean. Lower Egypt particularly is this delta area here, and upper is this thread of green land that stretches all the way out into the unknown territories beyond Kush. So if we zoom in a little bit, let me actually go back, make it clear. This is Jerusalem. Jerusalem is where the entire story of Isaiah takes place. Isaiah lived in Jerusalem. There's no indication he left Jerusalem. All of his writing would be here in Jerusalem. And this is an interesting thing because he talks about all the nations around them, but there's no indication that any of these nations had any of his writings or ever heard any of his messages about them. So all of it's happening here in Jerusalem. And this is the focal point of the entire book of Isaiah. And if we zoom in on that area, this gives you an idea of what is going on around Jerusalem. Now, there is this kingdom to the north here called Syria. Notice that Syria and Assyria are two different places. Syria is also known as Aram, is where the language Aramaic comes from, or the Arameans come from there. So this is Syria over here, and it is, by comparison, a moderate-sized kingdom. They're not nothing, but they're nowhere near the size of Assyria. And then over here on the coast is Lebanon, and this is where Tyre and Sidon, the great seafaring peoples, live over here. The Phoenicians and so forth are over here in Lebanon, dominating the coast over here. And then we have Israel, which is right here, also known as Samaria. The term Samaritans comes from this northern area here. And they have this area around the Lake of Galilee and these highlands up here that are rather fertile. And there's some great hill country through here. This is where the northern kingdom of Israel is, which at this time has separated centuries before this from the lower kingdom of Judah. Judah is where Isaiah lives, particularly in the city of Jerusalem. It is in the hill country down here. And over on the coast, where modern Gaza Strip is where the Philistines live. And they control this area along the coast, and they have a set of cities that are right around here, south of Tel Aviv. And then you have Jerusalem here that's up in the hill country. And then there's this very steep drop-off and desert area here that goes down to where the Dead Sea is. And so getting from Jerusalem down to the Dead Sea, it's a bit of a perilous journey because it's through some very harsh deserts and quite a drop in elevation. Down here on the Dead Sea, we're going to talk about a little bit that the Dead Sea Scrolls come from Qumran, which is right along the shores of the Dead Sea. And there was a group of caves and communities all along this coast here that preserve documents for us, which is quite important to us. But this is the zoom in of what's happening around Jerusalem. And all of these things are going to play into this. I don't think I mentioned Edom. The Edomites live down here in the south. There's also the Moabites that live up here in this area. I don't have them labeled, but trying not to overwhelm you with so many nations. But one of the things that you'll find throughout the book of Isaiah is politics play a huge role. And if you don't have any idea who these nations are that he's talking about, it can be very difficult to understand what's going on. But yes, these are all somewhat minor players, all of these. somewhat minor players that are regional powers, whereas Assyria is the world superpower. Egypt is a fading superpower and perhaps the last hope at standing up to Assyria, but it is nothing like what it once was. And so we know that during the time of Isaiah, Egypt had a lot of control through this area, but Assyria is eating away at it and taking over things in a very brutal manner. So Isaiah's lifetime was one of terrible war. And to help you understand just how small an area this is, if you're in the United States, this might help you. This line here represents a city that's in the very southern part of Utah and one that's in the northern part of Utah. So that's my home state. To give you an idea here of just how small this area is, it's about the size of the state of Utah. You could drive across it in about 5 or 6 hours. That's what we're talking about in this immediate region. When you start bringing in the faraway places of Egypt and Assyria, it gets to be a bit further, but it's nowhere near as large of distances as we think of in the United States, like between Los Angeles and New York. It's nothing like those kind of distances. This is all much more compact. Everybody is right on top of each other. These territories they held were not large territories. The populace that we're talking about were not huge cities. They were medium-sized cities, and they were fairly compact in the amount of land that this filled. So this is a basic timeline of what's happening here. Back in 739 BCE is when Isaiah first gets his vision and calling. And we'll go through that in chapter 6, where he talks about that happening. This is when he starts his ministry. Then, while he's several years into his ministry in 722, and remember, these are BCE dates, so they're running backwards. 739 was before 722. So they're running backwards. These are obviously not the dates they used at the time, but this is using our dating system and projecting it back onto them. 722, let's see, that is 17 years. Is my math right on that? I think that's 17 years. Later, after Isaiah has been preaching for 17 years, at that time, the northern kingdom of Israel, or Samaria, is destroyed by Assyria. Syria is also destroyed by Assyria at that time too. And so the northern kingdom is wiped out. They watched the people be deported. They watched people being slaughtered. They watched cities being laid sieged and starved to death. It was a terrible, brutal time. And they witnessed all of this in 722. It was terrifying for them. And they knew that they were going to be next. So then 21 years later, so this is not immediate, 21 years later, Assyria winds up at their doorstep, coming to the very gates of Jerusalem, and they live. It's an amazing story. And interestingly, it is a story that we have corroborated in the Assyrian record as well as the biblical record. It's one of the places where history and biblical accounts line up most nicely. So we'll talk a lot about that. It is a very dramatic showdown, but we will see Assyria, the largest power on earth, come right up to the gates of Zion and try and conquer it and fail, and have the little small city of Zion actually survive the encounter. Isaiah dies, we're not sure of an exact date. Somewhere around 680, though, seems reasonable for when his death was. But he talked about a lot of things that are going to be far into the future from his lifetime. And so in 612 BCE, we will see Babylon strike down Assyria, and Babylon will then become the dominant power in the region. Then Babylon will march on Jerusalem. This time, Jerusalem will not survive. Jerusalem will be destroyed around 595. Yeah, around 5, somewhere in Jerusalem is destroyed. There's actually a couple of battles that happened as to which one is the exact destruction. But yeah, Jerusalem is going to fall to Babylon. And the Jews will be deported, much like the northern kingdom was deported by Assyria. The Jews are going to be deported by the Babylonians. It will become what is known as the Babylonian exile. And they will spend 70 years in exile. And this will end when Persia then defeats Babylon. And Cyrus, often known as Cyrus the Great, issues the proclamation that the Jews can return to their homeland of Judah, reestablish Jerusalem, and rebuild the temple that has been destroyed. And that will end the Babylonian exile and open the way for the cultures that would develop there, bringing about the whole Second Temple period and the close of the biblical era. And so that's our timeline of what's going to happen in the book of Isaiah and what's going to be discussed throughout the book of Isaiah. Hello, everybody. This is future me here during the editing process. And this video just got too long. We're going to break it into 3 parts. So I'm going to end part 1 here. If this information was useful to you, please like and subscribe and join us over on Discord. This is the first part here that's covering the politics and history around the area. In the second part of the introduction, we're going to talk a little bit about how we got our modern book of Isaiah and some of the source texts that are available to understand it. I'll be releasing these probably within a few days of each other, but I just wanted some shorter segments here that were a little bit more consumable rather than one giant lecture. So I'm going to break this down a bit more into smaller units. Anyway, I'll see you in the next one.